In the annals of warfare, there are weapons that carry with them not just the capacity for destruction, but a particular weight of horror, tools of combat that blur the line between military necessity and human nightmare. The flamethrower stands among these, and nowhere in the Pacific theatre of World War II did its terrible utility become more grimly evident than on a small volcanic island that would become synonymous with sacrifice and suffering. The numbers alone tell part of the story, though they can barely convey the reality. When American forces committed their flamethrower specialists to the invasion of this island, roughly 300 of these men went ashore carrying weapons that marked them for almost certain death. By the time the fighting ended weeks later, only 18 of them remained alive. The mathematics of their survival was measured not in days or hours, but in minutes of actual combat exposure. Yet the role they played proved absolutely irreplaceable in breaking open one of the most formidable defensive systems ever constructed. The island itself was nothing more than a desolate heap of volcanic matter thrust up from the Pacific floor, barely 8 square miles of black sand and rocky outcroppings, devoid of any natural beauty or resource that might justify the blood about to be spilled across its surface. Yet geography and timing conspired to make this barren place one of the most strategically significant pieces of real estate in the entire war. Situated roughly halfway between the Mariana Islands, which American forces had secured months earlier, and the Japanese home islands themselves, this speck of land occupied a position that both sides understood would prove decisive in the final phase of the Pacific campaign. American planners had committed to a strategic bombing offensive against Japanese industrial and military targets using the massive B-29 Superfortress bombers, flying these missions from airfields constructed in the Marianas. But the distances involved created severe operational challenges. The bombers had to fly routes that brought them within range of radar installations and fighter squadrons based on this intermediate island, giving Japanese defenders advance warning and opportunities for interception. Damaged aircraft limping home from raids often couldn't make the full distance back to their bases. The bombing runs themselves had to be conducted with reduced payloads to accommodate the fuel requirements for such extended missions. Capturing this island would fundamentally alter the strategic equation. Fighter aircraft could use it as a forward base, flying escort missions for the bombers and engaging Japanese interceptors before they could threaten the heavy bombers. Crippled B-29s would have an emergency landing site, saving crews and expensive aircraft that would otherwise be lost to the ocean. The shorter distances would allow bombers to carry significantly heavier bomb loads while consuming less fuel, making each raid more destructive and sustainable. Both American and Japanese leadership recognized these realities with perfect clarity, and both understood that the coming battle would be fought with a desperation born of strategic necessity. The Japanese approached the defense of the island with a cold-eyed assessment of their situation that marked a significant evolution in their tactical thinking. In earlier island battles throughout the Pacific, Japanese forces had typically concentrated their defenses at the waterline, attempting to annihilate invasion forces as they came ashore. This approach had resulted in catastrophic losses at places like Tarawa and Saipan, where American naval gunfire and aerial bombardment had simply pulverized defensive positions before Marines ever set foot on the beaches. The officer placed in command of the island's defense was a general who had studied these disasters carefully and drew hard lessons from them. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi was a thoughtful, experienced commander who understood that his forces had no hope of preventing an American landing through beach defenses alone. Instead, he would transform the entire island into a killing ground from which there would be no escape and no quick victory. The volcanic composition of the island proved ideally suited to Kuribayashi's vision. The rock was soft enough to excavate but stable enough to support extensive underground construction. Under his direction, Japanese forces spent months carving an elaborate subterranean network into the island's interior, creating a defensive system unlike anything American forces had previously encountered. They dug more than 11 miles of interconnected tunnels, linking hundreds of fighting positions in a web that allowed defenders to move unseen beneath the surface. Artillery pieces were positioned in caves with carefully calculated fields of fire, then connected to the tunnel network so they could be withdrawn and hidden after firing. Machine gun nests were constructed with interlocking coverage patterns, ensuring that every approach was covered by multiple weapons. Bunkers and pillboxes were built with extraordinary attention to concealment and structural integrity, often reinforced with concrete and positioned to be nearly invisible until attackers were already within killing range. The defensive philosophy represented a complete departure from the suicidal banzai charges and beach line stands that had characterized earlier Japanese defensive efforts. Kuribayashi explicitly forbade such wasteful tactics, instead instructing his men to remain hidden, conserve ammunition, and extract the maximum possible cost from the attackers through patient, disciplined fire. Every position was pre-registered for mortar and artillery fire, with ranges carefully measured and noted. Defenders were trained to allow American forces to advance past initial positions before opening fire, creating confusion and making it impossible to establish a clear front line. The entire island became a maze of death, where progress measured in yards came at the cost of lives measured in dozens. American intelligence gathering prior to the invasion failed to grasp the scale and sophistication of the defensive preparations. Aerial reconnaissance showed evidence of fortifications, but the extent of the underground network remained hidden. Planners estimated they would face approximately 13,000 defenders, a significant undercount of the actual garrison of nearly 23,000 men, almost all of whom were now concealed in positions that would survive the preliminary bombardment. The Americans approached the invasion with tactics that had proven successful in previous amphibious assaults. Days of naval gunfire and aerial bombing preceded the landing, shells and bombs raining down on the island in quantities that seemed sufficient to obliterate any defensive capability. Observers watching from ships offshore saw the island disappear beneath clouds of smoke and debris, the surface churned and cratered by high explosives. It appeared that nothing could survive such a pounding, that the landing would be opposed only by whatever shell-shocked remnants remained in the rubble. The assault began in the early morning of February 19, 1945, with waves of landing craft carrying Marines toward beaches designated by colour codes. As the craft approached shore, the men aboard could see that the beaches were composed of volcanic ash and sand, black and loose, utterly unlike the coral and rock of other Pacific islands. The first Marines to step off their landing craft immediately encountered difficulties that no amount of training had prepared them for. The volcanic sand was so fine and loose that it behaved almost like a dry liquid, offering no solid footing. Men sank to their ankles with every step, struggling to maintain balance under the weight of combat equipment. Vehicles bogged down immediately, tracks spinning uselessly as they settled deeper into the ash. The steep terraces rising from the beach were composed of the same treacherous material, making any attempt to dig defensive positions an exercise in frustration as the sand simply flowed back into any hole. For nearly an hour after the initial landing, the situation seemed almost anticlimactic. Sporadic fire came from the heights overlooking the beaches, but nothing like the immediate and overwhelming resistance that had greeted Marines at other invasions. Men moved inland cautiously, advancing up the terraces and into the island's interior, wondering if perhaps the bombardment had been even more effective than hoped. Then, with timing that demonstrated perfect fire discipline and centralized command, the entire defensive system came alive at once. Hidden mortars opened fire, their crews using pre-calculated ranges to drop shells with precision into the crowded beaches where follow-on waves were still landing. Machine guns that had remained silent now revealed themselves, firing from positions that offered overlapping fields of fire across every approach. Artillery that had been carefully concealed in caves and bunkers began systematic bombardment of predetermined killing zones. Marines who had been advancing with relative ease suddenly found themselves trapped in a nightmare of interlocking fire with no obvious source and no clear enemy to engage. The casualties in those first hours were devastating. Men fell in clusters, cut down by fire that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Medical corpsmen braved the storm of steel to reach wounded men, only to become casualties themselves. Unit cohesion frayed as squads became separated in the smoke and confusion, and the treacherous terrain made movement agonizingly slow. Yet despite the horrific losses, the assault continued through sheer determination and training. Marines pushed forward because going back was not an option, because their mission demanded progress regardless of cost. As the day wore on and units began to penetrate deeper into the island's interior, the true nature of the defense became apparent. This was not a conventional battle with clear lines and recognizable objectives. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere, able to appear from concealed positions, inflict casualties, and then vanish into the tunnel network before concentrated fire could be brought to bear. Pillboxes emerged as one of the most deadly features of the defensive system. These were not improvised fighting positions, but carefully engineered structures, typically constructed of reinforced concrete with walls thick enough to resist all but direct hits from the heaviest naval guns. They were built low to the ground, often partially buried and camouflaged with volcanic ash and rock until they were nearly invisible against the landscape. Firing slits were narrow, offering minimal target area while allowing defenders to cover wide areas with machine gun and rifle fire. Many were positioned to support each other, so that any attempt to approach one position would immediately draw fire from multiple others. The interiors were frequently designed with angles and bends that would absorb the blast from grenades or satchel charges, protecting the occupants even when attackers managed to get explosive devices through the firing ports. Assaulting one of these positions required tactics that seemed suicidal to those who had to execute them. A team would have to cross open ground under fire, carrying explosives or attempting to get close enough to use grenades, all while the pillbox crew poured fire at them and supporting positions engaged anyone who tried to provide covering fire. Even when assault teams succeeded in placing charges and destroying an entrance, they often discovered that the defenders had simply withdrawn through connected tunnels and would reappear in another position behind the advancing Marines. Traditional infantry weapons proved frustratingly inadequate against these fortifications. Rifle fire could not penetrate the embrasures effectively. Grenades often failed to reach the interior or inflict decisive damage. Explosive charges could collapse entrances, but rarely killed defenders who had space to retreat into protective alcoves. The American forces needed a weapon that could reach into these positions and neutralize them conclusively, something that could defeat both the physical structure and the human defenders in a way that conventional weapons could not. The flamethrower, horrifying as it was, proved to be one of the few weapons capable of reliably clearing pillboxes and cave positions. The standard man-portable version carried by Marine assault teams was designated the M2, a system that consisted of two cylindrical tanks containing thickened gasoline, positioned on either side of a central pressure tank filled with nitrogen. The fuel tanks connected to a flexible hose that ran to a gun-like wand held by the operator, with an ignition system at the nozzle that would light the stream of fuel as it was expelled under pressure. The entire assembly weighed approximately 70 pounds when fully loaded, a significant burden that had to be carried in addition to standard combat equipment. The effective range was limited to roughly 20 yards under ideal conditions, often less in the field when wind or terrain interfered with the stream of burning fuel. A full load of fuel would provide only about 7 seconds of actual flame time, delivered in short bursts to maximize effectiveness and avoid exhausting the supply too quickly. Operating this weapon demanded a particular kind of courage that went beyond the ordinary bravery expected of infantry soldiers. The operator had to advance to distances that were closer than grenade range, moving into areas where enemy fire would be most concentrated. Every time the weapon fired, it announced the operator's position with unmistakable clarity. The roar of igniting fuel, the brilliant stream of flame, the thick black smoke that followed each burst, all of these made concealment impossible. Japanese defenders quickly learned to recognize the distinctive silhouette created by the triple tank configuration on an operator's back, and they understood with perfect clarity what awaited them if a flamethrower operator got close enough to employ the weapon effectively. Standing orders in Japanese defensive positions prioritized killing flamethrower operators above almost any other target. Snipers were instructed to watch for them specifically. Machine gunners were told to concentrate fire on them regardless of other threats. Every defender understood that a flamethrower reaching effective range meant almost certain death for anyone in the targeted position, so stopping the operator became a matter of desperate self-preservation. The mathematics of survival for these operators reflected this targeting priority with brutal clarity. Squad mates would do everything possible to provide covering fire and suppression, trying to keep enemy defenders occupied while the flamethrower operator made the final approach. Yet even with the best support, many operators never made it close enough to employ their weapons. They were cut down in the open, their fuel tanks sometimes rupturing from bullet strikes and creating fireballs that consumed them. Those who did reach effective range had only seconds to deliver their payload before having to withdraw, as remaining in position meant certain death. The act of firing was itself traumatic on multiple levels. Operators were trained to take a deep breath before pressing the trigger because the weapon's discharge would create a roar and blast of heat so intense that normal breathing became impossible while the flame was jetting forward. The pressure wave, the sound, the heat, all combined to create a sensory assault on the operator that went beyond mere physical danger. The psychological weight of using such a weapon added another layer of burden. At the distances where flamethrowers were employed, operators could see their targets with terrible clarity. They witnessed the effects of what they were doing in ways that other combatants might be spared. The weapon's nature meant there was no distance, no abstraction to soften the reality of taking human lives in one of the most agonizing ways imaginable. Many operators carried vivid memories of these moments for the rest of their lives, haunted by sights and sounds and smells that never fully faded. The weapon could also turn on its user in ways that other infantry weapons rarely did. A mechanical malfunction might cause fuel to spray back toward the operator. A sudden shift in wind could blow flame into the operator's face. The ignition system might fail, leaving the operator standing in the open, having just announced his position without achieving any effect. Training emphasized the dangers and attempted to prepare men for the violence of what they would experience, but no amount of training could fully prepare someone for the reality. For Japanese defenders, the flamethrower represented a particularly dreaded threat, and this dread translated into merciless treatment of any operators who were captured. These men were not seen as ordinary enemy soldiers, but as wielders of a weapon considered especially cruel and barbaric. There were accounts from the island of operators who were captured alive after their weapons malfunctioned or were damaged, and the fate of these men was invariably horrific. In one documented incident, an operator's weapon failed at the entrance to a cave complex. Before his squad mates could pull him back, defenders rushed out and dragged him underground into the tunnel system. His fellow Marines could hear him screaming for 2 days afterward, the sounds echoing from the cave entrance, but there was no way to reach him without sacrificing more lives in what would certainly be a futile rescue attempt. This grim possibility hung over every mission, every advance where flamethrower operators had to expose themselves to enemy fire. The knowledge that capture meant not just death but prolonged torture added a psychological burden to the already overwhelming physical dangers. The tactics for employing flamethrowers evolved as operators gained experience with the unique challenges of the island's defensive positions. One technique that proved particularly effective against bunkers and caves was called a wet burst. Instead of igniting the fuel immediately, the operator would first spray unignited gasoline into the target, saturating the interior and any defenders inside. A follow-up burst would then ignite this fuel cloud, creating a more complete combustion that ensured the flame reached every corner and crevice of the enclosed space. The effects inside a pillbox or cave were catastrophic in ways that went beyond the direct burning. Fire in an enclosed space would spike temperatures to thousands of degrees almost instantaneously. The combustion consumed oxygen at a tremendous rate, creating conditions where defenders might suffocate even if they were not directly touched by flame. The blast pressure from the rapid expansion of gases could cause internal injuries. Those who survived the initial burst often found themselves in a space filled with toxic smoke and superheated air that seared lungs with every breath. The weapon's effectiveness came from this combination of thermal, asphyxiation, and blast effects, making it uniquely suited to neutralizing defenders who had otherwise proven nearly impossible to dislodge with conventional weapons. Despite, or perhaps because of this terrible effectiveness, the attrition rate among flamethrower operators remained catastrophically high throughout the battle. Units would land with their full complement of trained operators and find themselves running short within days as men were killed or wounded at rates that far exceeded ordinary infantry casualties. The Marines needed a way to deliver the same effects with greater protection for the operators and greater capacity for sustained operations. The solution came in the form of armoured flamethrowers, tanks that had been modified to carry flame-projecting equipment instead of conventional main guns. These vehicles, typically based on the Sherman tank chassis and designated M4A3R3 in military nomenclature, represented a significant evolution in flamethrower technology and tactics. Outwardly, these flame tanks resembled standard Sherman tanks closely enough that casual observers might not immediately recognize the difference. The key modification was the replacement of the main gun with a flame projector that could throw burning fuel at ranges up to 3 times greater than man-portable units, roughly 100 yards under favorable conditions. The fuel capacity was measured in hundreds of gallons rather than the few gallons carried by infantry operators, allowing for sustained firing over extended periods. The armor provided protection for the crew from small arms fire and shell fragments that would easily kill an exposed infantry operator. These vehicles could approach defensive positions with relative impunity, deliver massive volumes of flame to saturate caves and bunkers, and then withdraw to rearm and refuel for subsequent missions. The tactical employment of flame tanks involved coordination with infantry and gun tanks in combined arms teams. Standard gun tanks would provide suppressive fire and engage any anti-tank weapons that might threaten the flame tank. Infantry would protect the tanks from close assault by Japanese defenders armed with magnetic mines or explosive charges. The flame tank would advance close enough to bring its projector to bear on the target, then unleash streams of burning fuel that would flow into every opening and crevice. The psychological effect on defenders was often as important as the physical destruction. The sight of a tank approaching with a flame projector was terrifying enough that some positions would be abandoned before the flame tank even fired. Those defenders who remained in place faced a weapon against which there was essentially no defense beyond fleeing through the tunnel network if such escape routes existed. The trade-offs and risks associated with flame tanks were considerable, despite the armoured protection they offered. Once a flame tank engaged a target, it became the focus of every enemy weapon within range. Japanese defenders knew that destroying a flame tank would remove one of the most effective weapons being used against them, and they directed anti-tank guns, artillery, and concentrated rifle fire at these vehicles whenever they appeared. The crews understood they were operating what amounted to a large container of highly flammable liquid surrounded by relatively thin armor. A penetrating hit that ruptured the fuel tanks could turn the entire vehicle into a funeral pyre from which escape would be nearly impossible. The psychological pressure of sitting inside such a vehicle under fire, knowing that a lucky shell or mine could incinerate the entire crew, required its own kind of courage. Yet despite these dangers, the flame tanks proved devastatingly effective in the close quarters fighting that characterized the battle. They could accomplish in minutes what might take infantry hours or days to achieve with conventional weapons, clearing strong points that had stalled entire advances. The defensive system created by General Kuribayashi had been designed with full knowledge that relief was impossible and that ultimate defeat was inevitable. His goal was not victory in any conventional sense, but rather to inflict maximum casualties and delay on the American forces, to make them pay such a high price for the island that it might influence strategic calculations about the cost of invading the Japanese home islands. In this grimly limited objective, the defense succeeded beyond what might have been expected. Every yard of advance came at the cost of casualties that shocked even veterans of previous island campaigns. The elaborate tunnel network meant that positions that appeared to have been cleared would suddenly spring back to life as defenders reappeared through underground routes. The interlocking fields of fire made movement lethal during daylight hours. The lack of any clear front line meant that rear areas were never truly secure, and units had to maintain constant vigilance against infiltration and attack from unexpected directions. For the attacking Marines, breaking this defense required not just firepower and tactical skill, but a willingness to employ methods as brutal as the terrain and enemy demanded. The Flamethrower, first carried into action by men whose life expectancy in combat could be measured in single-digit minutes, then later mounted on armoured vehicles that became mobile funeral pyres for their crews, emerged as an essential tool for prying open an island that had been transformed into a fortress of volcanic rock and reinforced concrete. The weapon's effectiveness came at a terrible cost, not just in lives lost, but in psychological trauma that marked those who used it. Operators who survived carried memories of what they had done and seen, images and sensations that time could never fully erase. The moral weight of employing such a weapon, necessary though it may have been for accomplishing the mission, added to the burden of physical danger and the horror of combat in ways that set these men apart even among the brotherhood of combat veterans. The island campaign ground on for weeks longer than planners had anticipated, every hill and cave system requiring separate reduction, every defensive position demanding blood payment for its capture. The casualties mounted to levels that stunned observers and participants alike, creating a butcher's bill that would influence American strategic thinking about the invasion of Japan itself. The Flamethrower operators, both those who died in the black volcanic ash and those who somehow survived to see the island finally secured, played a role in this battle that was both absolutely essential and almost unbearably costly. Without them and the terrible weapon they carried forward into point-blank range of enemy positions, the defensive system might have proven impossible to crack in any time frame that would have been acceptable. With them, progress came at a price measured in trauma, terror, and human lives consumed in one of the most brutal campaigns of the Pacific War. The final statistics, when compiled after the fighting ended, told a story that numbers alone could never fully convey. Of the 300 men who went ashore as flamethrower specialists, only 18 walked off the island alive. This survival rate, roughly 6%, was by far the lowest of any specialized role in the battle, and perhaps in the entire Pacific theater. These men had been asked to carry a weapon that marked them for immediate targeting by every enemy soldier, to advance into kill zones where survival was measured in seconds, to employ a tool whose effects they witnessed with horrifying clarity at distances measured in feet rather than yards. The psychological screening that selected men for this duty sought individuals with certain qualities: steadiness under pressure, ability to function while experiencing extreme stress, willingness to accept nearly certain death in the execution of duty. Yet no screening process could truly prepare someone for the reality of what they would face, and no training could fully condition them for the sensory and moral assault of using fire as a weapon against human beings trapped in enclosed spaces with no possibility of escape. The Japanese defenders who faced these weapons experienced a different kind of horror. Trapped in positions from which retreat was often impossible due to collapsed tunnels or tactical considerations, they watched flamethrower operators approach with the knowledge of what awaited them. The psychological impact of facing such a weapon went beyond mere fear of death. Fire represents one of humanity's most primal terrors, and the prospect of being burned alive in a confined space where escape is impossible touches something fundamental in human psychology. Some defenders broke and fled when flame tanks appeared, abandoning positions they had held against conventional assault. Others remained at their posts and died in circumstances that must have been absolutely terrifying, consumed by fire or asphyxiated in the superheated, toxic atmosphere created by combustion in enclosed spaces. The moral calculus of warfare had led to the deployment of a weapon that inflicted death in one of the most agonizing forms imaginable, justified by military necessity, but carrying a psychological and ethical weight that could never be fully resolved. When the island was finally secured after more than a month of continuous combat, the cost had been staggering on both sides. American casualties exceeded 25,000, including nearly 7,000 dead. Japanese losses were almost total, with fewer than 1,000 of the 23,000 defenders surviving to be taken prisoner, the rest dead in their tunnels and bunkers or in final suicidal charges when organized defense finally collapsed. The island itself had been purchased at a price that shocked military planners and political leaders, raising profound questions about the potential cost of invading the Japanese home islands. The role of the flamethrower in achieving this costly victory was undeniable. Post-battle assessments concluded that the weapon had been absolutely essential for reducing the defensive positions that conventional weapons could not effectively neutralize. Yet this effectiveness had been achieved through the sacrifice of the men who carried these weapons forward, exposed and vulnerable, into the closest and most personal ranges of combat, where death came not from distant artillery or unseen snipers, but from enemy soldiers close enough to see clearly as they pulled triggers and threw grenades. The legacy of the flamethrower operators on this volcanic island extends beyond tactical lessons and casualty statistics. Their experience represents an extreme point in the spectrum of combat roles, a duty that combined near-certain death with the psychological burden of wielding one of warfare's most terrible weapons. The men who survived carried physical and psychological scars that mark them for the rest of their lives. Many struggled with what today would be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, haunted by memories of what they had done and witnessed. Some found it impossible to speak about their experiences, the weight of memory too heavy to share even with family and loved ones. Others felt compelled to testify, to ensure that the cost paid on that island would not be forgotten or dismissed as mere statistics in military histories. The weapon itself continued in military service for years after the war, employed in Korea and Vietnam and other conflicts where its unique capabilities made it valuable for certain tactical situations. Yet it never lost its aura of horror, never became just another tool in the military arsenal. International humanitarian law would eventually place restrictions on incendiary weapons, acknowledging the particular cruelty of their effects. But on that small volcanic island in early 1945, such considerations were subordinated to the immediate tactical problem of breaking a defense that conventional weapons could not defeat. The men who carried flamethrowers ashore, knowing their survival prospects were measured in minutes of combat exposure, knowing the weapon made them priority targets, knowing what awaited them if captured, went forward anyway because their mission demanded it, and their training had prepared them to accept almost any cost in the execution of duty. The story of these operators and their terrible weapon illuminates the brutal arithmetic of combat in ways that sanitized after-action reports can never convey. War in its most fundamental form comes down to individuals making decisions to move forward into situations where death is not just possible but likely, to continue functioning while experiencing levels of fear and stress that would paralyze most human beings, to employ violence in service of objectives that may seem abstract when weighed against the immediate reality of survival. The flamethrower operators embodied this reality in its most extreme form, carrying a weapon that guaranteed they would be targeted first and most intensely, that offered no possibility of engaging the enemy from safe distances, that demanded they close to ranges where they could see the faces of those they were about to kill. The fact that only 6% survived speaks to the suicidal nature of the role they were asked to fill, yet fill it they did, advancing across volcanic ash into storms of fire because the mission required it, and because their training and sense of duty left them no choice they could live with. In the years since that battle, military historians and veterans have debated the necessity and morality of various tactical choices made during the campaign. The flamethrower's role has been central to many of these discussions. Critics point to the weapon's horrific effects and question whether its use was justified, even given the tactical advantages it provided. Defenders argue that the defensive system created by the Japanese left American forces with few alternatives, that conventional weapons had proven inadequate for reducing positions that had been specifically engineered to withstand bombardment and assault. The debate continues because it touches on fundamental questions about the limits of acceptable violence in warfare, about whether certain weapons cross lines that should not be crossed regardless of tactical utility. Yet for the men who were there, who faced the reality of trying to advance against a defense that had turned an entire island into a killing ground, the flamethrower represented not an abstract ethical question, but a practical tool that could accomplish tasks that nothing else could achieve. The 18 survivors of the original 300 operators carried forward lives marked by their experiences in ways both visible and hidden. Some received medals and recognition for their actions, acknowledgement of the extraordinary courage required to perform their duties. Others returned home to struggle in silence with memories and trauma that 50s-era society was ill-equipped to understand or address. All of them had seen and done things that set them apart, that created an unbridgeable gap between their experiences and those of people who had not been tested in the same crucible. The survivors' guilt that many felt, wondering why they had lived when so many others had died, added another layer of psychological burden to the already heavy weight of memory. These men had volunteered or been selected for a role that military planners knew would result in catastrophic casualties, had been trained and equipped and sent forward with full knowledge that most would not return, and had performed their duties despite this knowledge because that was what was expected and required of them. The broader strategic context of the battle has sometimes been overshadowed by the tactical details of the fighting, but it remains crucial for understanding why such costs were accepted and why weapons like the flamethrower were employed despite their terrible effects. American planners believed the island was necessary for the air campaign against Japan, and subsequent events seemed to validate this assessment. Fighter escorts flying from the island's captured airfields did provide protection for bomber formations that previously had been vulnerable to interception. Damaged B-29s did use the island as an emergency landing site, with thousands of airmen owing their lives to the availability of this option. The bombing campaign did intensify after the island's capture, delivering heavier payloads with greater frequency than had been possible before. Whether these benefits justified the cost remains a question that individuals must answer for themselves based on their own moral frameworks and understanding of the strategic situation. What cannot be disputed is that the costs were real and were paid primarily by young men who had no voice in the strategic decisions but who bore the consequences of those decisions with their bodies and their sanity and their lives. The flamethrower operators represent an extreme but not unique example of how modern warfare distributes risk and burden unevenly, placing certain individuals in situations where survival becomes unlikely or impossible, while others perform essential but less immediately deadly roles. The specialization of military function creates hierarchies of danger, and those at the extreme end of this spectrum face situations that most of humanity will never confront and could barely imagine. The operators who carried their weapons forward into point-blank range of enemy positions, who fired their bursts of flame, knowing that doing so would almost certainly result in their own deaths within the next few minutes, who continued to function and fight despite fear and exhaustion and the certain knowledge of their fates, these men demonstrated something about human capacity and human courage that transcends tactical analysis and strategic assessment. They did what was asked of them in circumstances that would have broken most people, and the fact that so few survived speaks not to any failure on their part, but to the overwhelming dangers they faced and the near impossibility of the tasks they were assigned. The volcanic island that cost so much to capture served its intended purpose for the final months of the war, its airfields hosting the fighters and emergency landings that planners had envisioned. When the war ended following the atomic bombings and Japanese surrender, the island's strategic importance evaporated almost overnight. The installations built at such cost were gradually abandoned or repurposed as the military drew down its Pacific forces. Today the island is returned to Japanese control, its tunnels and defensive works preserved as monuments and memorials to a battle that both sides remember as emblematic of war's capacity for consuming human lives in pursuit of objectives that may seem abstract when measured against the individual costs paid by those who did the actual fighting and dying. The flamethrower operators who died in the volcanic ash have their names inscribed on memorial walls, their sacrifice acknowledged in official histories and commemorations. But the true memorial to what they endured exists in the memories of the handful who survived, in the testimony they provided when they could bear to speak of what they experienced, in the historical record that documents not just what they accomplished, but what it cost them to accomplish it. In contemplating the experience of these men and the weapon they carried into battle, we confront uncomfortable truths about warfare and human nature. The flamethrower's effectiveness derived from its capacity to inflict death in one of the most terrible forms imaginable, and its employment required individuals willing to use such a weapon despite the moral weight that came with it. The men who filled this role did so not because they were somehow immune to normal human feelings or moral considerations, but because they had been trained to compartmentalize, to focus on the immediate tactical mission while suppressing the broader implications of what they were doing. This ability to function while carrying an almost unbearable psychological burden represents both a testament to human adaptability and a warning about what war demands of those who fight it. The operators knew what their weapons did to human beings trapped in pillboxes and caves. They witnessed the effects at distances measured in feet. They smelled the results and heard the sounds and carried those sensory memories for the rest of their lives. Yet they continued to perform their duties because the alternative, refusing to employ the weapon that could break defensive positions, would have meant even higher casualties among their fellow Marines attempting to assault these positions with inadequate tools. The 60,000 characters we have traced through this narrative can only begin to capture the reality of what these men experienced, what they witnessed, what they were required to do in service of military objectives. The statistics about survival rates and combat effectiveness, while shocking, cannot convey the lived experience of individual operators making their approaches across open ground under fire, feeling the weight of the fuel tanks on their backs, knowing they had perhaps 7 seconds of flame time to accomplish their mission before needing to withdraw or die trying. The historical analysis of the battle's strategic importance and tactical innovations cannot capture the sensory assault of actually using the weapon, the roar and heat and pressure, the necessity of holding one's breath while firing, the too close view of what happens to human beings when they are engulfed in burning fuel. These experiential realities exist beyond the reach of historical narrative, accessible only to those who lived them and to some extent incommunicable even among that small group of survivors who share the burden of memory. As we conclude this account, the essential facts remain stark and unchanging. 300 men carried flamethrowers onto a volcanic island in February 1945, knowing their survival prospects were minimal at best. Only 18 of them lived to leave that island when the fighting finally ended over a month later. Their weapon proved essential for breaking a defensive system that had been specifically engineered to resist conventional assault, but this tactical effectiveness was purchased at a cost that defies comfortable moral calculus. These men went forward anyway, advanced into kill zones where death was nearly certain, employed their terrible weapons against enemy soldiers who were themselves trapped in an impossible situation, and in doing so helped secure an island that strategic planners believed necessary for prosecuting the final phase of the war against Japan. Whether their sacrifice was justified, whether the island's capture was worth the cost, whether there might have been other ways to accomplish the same objectives, these questions remain subjects of debate and will likely never be resolved to everyone's satisfaction. What we can say with certainty is that the cost was paid, primarily by young men who had no voice in the strategic decisions, but who bore the consequences with courage that stands as testimony to human capacity for endurance in the face of circumstances that seem designed to break mind and spirit along with the body.